Okay, so practicalities of research. Let's start with basically something I've mentioned to you before, this distinction between the normative and the descriptive approaches to research, and what you might call the textbook model, the normative approach here. So bear in mind that when you read a textbook, this is how it, in a sense, should be done, but it isn't necessarily how it will be done or how you'll have to do it. And what we're going to be talking about now is a series of issues that kind of go beyond that normative, how it ought to be done kind of model of research. So the very neat stages and so on that you go through aren't necessarily what happens. For example, the textbook model says don't collect your data until you're very clear about what you're going to be doing and so on. And I have to say that's probably good advice if you're going to be doing an experiment. And certainly if you're doing a questionnaire-based survey, you need to do a lot of preparation beforehand to be very clear about what you're going to be doing in the questionnaire or how you're going to design your experiment, whatever. Because it'd be a disaster if you just went out there and ad hoc kind of did an ad hoc design. So yes, it's good advice for that. But in many cases, in a more complex project where you might be doing a variety of different methods or where you might be working over a longer time period, it doesn't always make sense not to collect data straight away. In fact, it might make sense to go straight out into the field and start finding out what's going on. So there's, the practical advice might vary from that normative model. In this case, it's not a bad idea to go out there and try and get some data. So this is an idealized model, is what I'm getting really. It's this idea that the kind of the stages which I've given at the top here, the idea of starting with a focus and a research question, and then you kind of work out how to design your work and collect the data, then you go out finally and collect it, analyze it, write it up and so on, that kind of stages, is very idealized. And the real world of research often involves changing those around and moving around the order, perhaps even starting with data collection, as I just said, or maybe doing other things, maybe restarting some sections and looping around and doing it again because it didn't work first time, or doing something different second time round. So it's a very linear model, but the real life is a little bit different from that. This is an alternative model, if you like, of how research actually gets done. And the garbage can is there to kind of illustrate this idea that things get shoved in. There's not a simple linear order of things, but rather you do things as and when they're required and perhaps redo things and so on. So it's a messy combination of all the kind of elements I've talked about, the theory, method, resources, solutions, the particular techniques of collection, analysis and so on, and in a different order. And bear in mind that there is this contrast then between the normative, the one that gets written up, and later on we'll look at some articles that kind of show you how it's written up, and that very often is the cleaned up version, the version that follows the textbook model in that kind of linear fashion, has all the details, as if that was what was intended from the very beginning. And on the other hand, there's the real world where real researchers are struggling to do things and get things done. And very often it's much more messy than that. It's much more like this, the garbage can model, where everything gets kind of shoved in and redone and cycled around and changed and so on, and modified, etc., in various ways. So that, in actual fact, the real research world is a lot more messy than you might imagine. So, I mean, that's the practicalities of research is recognising that actually the normative model is what that means, normative. It's how it ought to be done, but not how it actually is done in many cases. Okay, so that's the first point then, that recognition of that distinction, that in fact actual work is often more messy than you finally write it up. By the way, I'll come back later on to talk about how you write it up, how you transform it from that messy reality of what you're starting with into this kind of refined kind of model that you present in the paper. Second point about the practicalities of research, access is negotiated. Now, I've said this several times throughout the sessions before. I mean, last week, talking about ethnography, I talked about the way that you get access into the field, into the setting you're investigating. And it's an important point of any kind of research, really. I mean, research is out there with people in some sense, or getting people into your laboratory. And you have to keep them on your side. So access is negotiated, you have to negotiate that, you have to keep people supporting you for the period of your research at least, and ideally for much, much longer than that, in case you, for example, might want to go back later and do a bit more. And the important point to bear in mind that the practicality research is that takes an awful long time. I suspect there's something you may come across very soon with your dissertations, that actually if you're going to do any kind of work that involves going outside the university, then it'll take time to negotiate that. You have to allow time for that. One particular area you need to allow time for in your field is ethics permission. So if you get into that kind of game of trying to get ethics permission, then it will take you an awful long time to do that, compared with the time you're actually studying for. So it can take months to go through that whole process. So be very aware of that. And you may even have to change your research ideas because of that time delay. But other things like getting access to the field, negotiating with where you're going to go to pick up your data or collect your data or whatever, can take time too. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Another point is, as I said, number 2, use friends, relatives. I mean, I've said this again several times, but a good way of getting into a field, to getting access to data, whether that's secondary data or going out and collecting your own data, is to have somebody in the field already who can sponsor you, who is a friend or a relative, someone you know who knows the field and can introduce you into it and say you're a bona fide researcher and give you support. When you're doing that negotiating, it's often worth thinking about this third point, the language you're using. It's very easy when you're working in the academic field to become accustomed to the idea that the words that we use, have a meaning for us. That research, for example, investigations, that means something nice and it's challenging perhaps to do, but it is something legitimate and good to do, to find out. But for people outside academia, those words may have quite different meanings. An investigation might bring up ideas of police investigation. Research might bring up, or evaluation might bring up ideas of judgment and so on, which are rather threatening things to do. So bear that in mind, that an interview, that's a police interview, isn't it? For most people, or a job interview. I mean, their experience of interviews is quite traumatic. So maybe it's worth thinking about alternative vocabulary when you're introducing these things. So that, rather than we're going to interview everybody, we're going to have a conversation, or we're going to talk to everybody in this organisation or whatever. So to avoid that kind of terminology that may not be threatening to you, but it might be off-putting to the people you're studying. And last of all, things like publishing. Publishing, again, particularly when you're negotiating access into somewhere, that can sound like we're going to kind of tell everybody what you're really doing. We're going to tell the world what's going on here, and that can sound quite threatening to people in organisations. So again, maybe some thinking about how you present that, how you ask about that. Write an account, but also particularly explain that you'll be doing it in the academic field, which means a relatively limited publication, if any publication at all. I mean, for most, master's dissertations, PhD dissertations, and so on, publication is very, very limited. Just to give you, if any of you thinking of going on to do PhDs, bear in mind that I think the median, have I got that right? The modal number of people who read a PhD is, I think, 0. That is, apart from the examiners, of course, the examiners have to read it, but apart from them, the average PhD gets read by nobody else, and of course the person who writes it, I shouldn't include them. And that's not to say that they don't get read at all. Some do get read, but it's a very limited audience, and even journals, of course, aren't read by large numbers of people. So writing an account, academic publishing, you have to explain that to the people you're negotiating with. Some further points upon that. As a way of encouraging people to allow you in, or to allow you to do the work, you can often offer a report. Give them some feedback on what you've done. I mean, one common way you can do this is if you're doing a survey, for example, you can offer to send a short report back to anyone who fills in your questionnaire. And they have to give you their address, of course, or their email address or whatever. But it's a way of kind of encouraging people who are interested to fill in your questionnaire. And in general, if you're doing any kind of research, you can offer that. It's not the report you'd write for your course or your funders or whatever. It's something else. It's something much more accessible and much briefer, usually less than a page of writing to do that. Other, I think, points I've made before in the module: find out who you're going to negotiate with the right people to get access, prepare an outline of the study, so you can then present that and say, this is what I'm going to do, so it's quite clear, and have a record of what you intend to do, all the various stages you want to go through and so on. Make a formal request, a letter in writing to the responsible person, the head of the organisation or head of the area you're going to. And of course discuss it with gatekeepers, the other key people in the organisation who are going to control your access. I've talked a lot about gatekeepers in other sessions. One thing you might not have thought about is discussing it with the actual participants. So not actually the research itself, but telling the participants what's going on, so they know who you are, what you're there for, what you're trying to find out about, and so on. You're, again, keeping them on side, making sure they know what's happening, not just suddenly a barrage of questions to them from some total stranger, but rather somebody who they're now familiar with, and they know exactly what you're trying to find out, and so on. And that helps. Be prepared to modify, and again, I think I said this right at the very beginning of the module, that when I talked about the normative model, that, of course, that doesn't always work, and sometimes you have to be prepared to modify, and that means change who you interview, change the design perhaps more radically, and so on, but certainly change the kind of questions you might want to ask, and so on, if certain questions are problematic. And of course, consider using a fully informed consent form. This means that everyone you talk to or interview or send a questionnaire to, but particularly if it's interviewing or any kind of ethnography, then a fully informed consent is probably the norm these days. Most ethics panels you go to will require you to show that you're doing that and have a copy of the form you're using. This is taken from the first edition of Colin Robson's Real World Research. I think it's in the second and third editions as well, but it just happens to be that version I got hold of. And it is just an attempt to show you what it looks like. But you can see, essentially, you give a bit of information about the project itself. You explain what's going on, and you get the person to sign it eventually, to say that they've read it, they understand what's going on, and so on. So they are consenting to you're doing the research with them, and they are signalling that they understand what it's about and what it's committing themselves to, and so on. And also that you can tell them all the kinds of reassurances about the ethics and anonymity and so on, whichever is appropriate. But here's one kind of, it's not a bad kind of starting point. And I think if you're working in the school, we have a school equivalent for that. I think we've got a website somewhere that the ethics panel operates, which has examples of these documents. So if you get involved in that kind of process, ethics panel research, then there is an equivalent to this document you can use from the school. Okay, so that's some of the access issues and negotiating access, negotiating with the respondents and so on. Another one of the issues which I had mentioned before, I think, at various points, is this one of insider and external access research. What are the pros and cons of being an insider, that is doing research on some body or some institution or some setting that you are already a member of? You work there, you go there, you're one of those kinds of people, whatever, as against being an outsider, being external to it in that sense. And there are big advantages to being an insider because it gives you that kind of familiarity and access and so on that you get. So here's the advantages. You have insider knowledge, of course. Having worked in the place or having been a member of the organisation or whatever, you know what's going on, you know what the issues are, you can go straight in and ask quite complex issues, quite complex questions because you understand what's going on. You don't have to do a lot of preparation beforehand. You have credibility. People know you. They know who you are, and whether you're covert or overt, in other words, whether they know you're doing research or don't know, doesn't really matter. They know who you are because you've been there before and they know what kind of person you are, and we hope you have credibility. I mean, of course, you may be not a credible person. They might think you're an idiot. Nothing I can do about that. You have, in that case, change jobs or go somewhere else. But let's assume that they don't think that you're a friend or you're a colleague and that they trust you. And of course, very practical things like no travel. You're already going there, so you don't have to go specially to the place. But there are disadvantages. Being an insider can blind you to certain things. And as I said here, first of all, there may be new additional roles. I mean, the idea of both doing the job and researching what you're doing can be quite a tough demand, doing two things at once. And that's probably the most challenging, is where you're being paid to do a job and you're trying to do research on that setting as well. You've got to find somehow carve time to do the research things you're doing alongside doing the job you're being paid to do. But it's equally challenging if it's a leisure activity. I mean, say you want to research, I don't know, things like pop concerts. Then obviously that may be something you go to. You may go to such concerts quite a lot, but you're going to have to spend time talking to other people, observing and so on. That means not listening to the music or not joining in or whatever. So it's a conflict of interest that's hard to manage. If you're in an organisation, then the next issue can be a problem. That is interviewing people above and below you. Say you're a middle manager in an organisation where you're about to do some research. Well, interviewing people well above you at the top of the organisation can be quite challenging because they won't tell you things. They know who you are, they know you're a middle manager, and they know there are certain things they can't say to you because that's confidential. That's not information they can give away to you. And maybe they'll be cautious for other reasons because they know who you are. Equally, people below you, perhaps managed by you, won't be open to you because you're their manager. So they're less, or maybe not your direct manager, but it might be you're the colleague of their manager. And so they won't necessarily tell you exactly what they think either. So that can be problematic that because of your position, that may kind of change the views you get of things. Of course, there may be issues about maintaining objectivity. You already are in the organisation, you feel proud about it, you feel committed to the organisation or the setting, you're more likely to find good things about it and be less critical. Particularly a problem if you're doing some kind of evaluation research, for example. So bear that in mind. And last of all, not least, is you have to live with your mistakes. If what you do causes problems, or perhaps even the results you find are not the results the organisation would like, and you publish them, then maybe you've got to live with that. You've got to live with those kinds of views that you come out with in the organisation, and that may be a tough one to call as well. Right, now a quick ragbag of other kinds of issues here. Get organised. Doing research does involve getting organised, doing things at the right time, in the right place, with the right people and so on. Lots of things going on at once. Probably the area where you need to get most organised is analysing the data. That's the real challenge, to get on top of all those bits of paper that you've got to deal with. But it's true when you're setting up meetings with people and being there on time and having all the stuff you need with you and making sure your recorders have batteries and so on and so forth. So all kinds of things like that you need to think about with organising. Secondly, pilot out test designs. I mean, I've said that again at great length with things like questionnaires. So it's a vital point that you pilot designs. Experiments too, probably the same, because the design of them is quite important. But you might do the same even with interviews. Just go out and test out your process with interviews before you start. Work on relationships. Now, I already talked about getting into a setting, negotiating access, but keep that negotiation going so that you keep people on side and on board, so they know what you're doing and that they are with you particularly if you have to modify things, you need to tell them why you're modifying things and doing things differently. Don't let resentment, antagonisms, etc. build up against you. One reason for keeping that good relationship going is because you don't want to just disappear at the end. Very often you find after you come back to your place of study or whatever, that there's more data to be got. You want to go back into the setting again. So you don't just leave and disappear, because you might want to come back 3 months later to find out something else. So you need to keep people on board for that reason. Another reason for writing that short report perhaps is because you can let people know what's going on and what you're doing. Some researchers even write letters to the organisation. I mean, to say thank you, of course, for letting them in, but also just simply to keep them involved. Yeah, I'm now writing up my things. I'm about to submit my dissertation or whatever. Just a little bit of news about what's happening to them that just keeps that relationship going. Be prepared to modify, which I've said a few times now. Catherine Haykim talks about this idea of trading down. In the end, it's always better to get some data, even if it's not quite what you intended, than nothing at all. Trade down because you can get something from it, rather than necessarily the pure model you started with, is maybe a best way to do it. Okay, so there's a number of issues of practicalities of research, particularly if you get involved in collecting data and going out into other settings.